Today's news did not move in a straight line. It arrived as a series of stress tests. Public safety systems were tested by deadly violence in Montreal and Chico, California. Courts tested the limits of federal power. Diplomats tried to hold together fragile Iran talks, while politics in Washington pulled in several directions at once. The World Cup delivered history, but also weather delays that felt like a preview of a hotter sporting future. And in markets, investors kept trying to decide whether SpaceX is the next great public company story, or whether the hype has simply outrun the fundamentals. So the theme of the day is resilience. Not in the inspirational poster sense, in the practical sense. Can police respond fast enough? Can courts hold the line? Can diplomacy survive political pressure? Can markets digest a giant new listing without losing discipline? Can infrastructure, from stadiums to rail systems to schools, function in a more volatile climate? That is the thread running through this Tuesday, June 23, 2026. Let's start with public safety, because that is where the day's most immediate human toll is. In Montreal, police said a gunman killed a police officer and a civilian at a Hilton hotel in Côte-de-Neige before being shot dead. Montreal Police Chief Fady Dagger said another officer was seriously wounded but in stable condition. Separate reporting said investigators found material inspired by incel ideology, but the motive has not yet been formally established. That distinction matters. In fast-moving cases, early evidence can point in a direction without fully explaining why violence happened. For investigators, motive is not just a label. It helps determine whether an attack was isolated, ideological, targeted, or part of a broader threat environment. In Chico, California, police said a shooting at the Butte County Library branch left 2 people dead and a child with a minor injury. The police chief said officers responded after a 911 call captured gunfire and screams inside the library. Officers formed an entry team, entered the building, and arrested a suspect who had fled out the back. A hotel. A library. These are not places most people associate with danger. And that is exactly why the public safety conversation keeps expanding. Police departments are not only preparing for violence in obvious high-risk locations. They are increasingly expected to prepare for violence in ordinary civic spaces, commercial spaces, and community institutions. There was also a grim development in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today co-host Savannah Guthrie. Reports citing law enforcement sources said a ransom note tied to her February disappearance from the Tucson area claimed she had died. Authorities, according to the reporting, have not announced that she has been found. And federal prosecutors said 2 more people were arrested in connection with an alleged plot to attack President Donald Trump's UFC event at the White House earlier this month. Prosecutors have described the alleged plan as an attack on a major public gathering. As always, those charged are presumed innocent unless proven guilty. These cases are different in almost every meaningful way: geography, evidence, possible motive, setting. But together, they underscore a common institutional challenge. Public safety now requires a wider perimeter. The threat environment can include hotels, libraries, political events, private homes, and online radicalization pathways. That puts pressure not only on police, but also on emergency communications, venue security, mental health systems, and the public's own expectations of safety. The courts were another major part of today's story. The Supreme Court reinstated Pedro Hernandez's murder conviction in the 1979 disappearance of 6-year-old Aton Pats. That case is one of the most famous missing child cases in American history. The legal issue today centered not on relitigating every fact of the original case, but on the limits of federal court review of state convictions under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. That law, often known as AEDPA, sharply restricts the ability of federal courts to overturn state criminal convictions. So the Supreme Court's move is not just about one cold case. It is also about deference, how much room federal courts should give state courts after a conviction has been obtained. Elsewhere, courts pushed back against federal power. In Minnesota, a federal judge quashed Trump administration subpoenas seeking immigration-related records from Governor Tim Walz and other state and local officials. The judge concluded that the subpoenas were aimed at coercing Minnesota officials into helping federal civil immigration enforcement, and at harassing or retaliating against them for refusing to do so. In Washington, Another federal judge blocked use of a revamped federal citizenship checking system after finding that it aggregated sensitive personal data in a way that could wrongly purge voters. The ruling halted state access to the expanded SAVE database for voter roll screening. And in Florida, a jury found real estate developer George Pino not guilty of vessel homicide and manslaughter in the 2022 Biscayne Bay boat crash that killed 17-year-old Luciana "Lucy" Fernandez. The verdict closed a closely watched Miami trial over whether a fatal boating accident met the legal threshold for criminal liability. Taken together, the legal stories point in two directions. On one hand, the Supreme Court reinforced the finality of a state conviction. On the other, lower courts signaled limits on executive power, particularly when immigration enforcement and voting systems intersect with state authority and individual rights. Now to the World Cup, where the drama was both historic and meteorological. Lionel Messi became the all-time leading scorer in men's World Cup history, scoring twice in Argentina's 2-0 win over Austria. Those goals moved him to 18 in World Cup play, passing Miroslav Klose's long-standing record. For sports fans, that is the headline. For investors and planners watching global events, there is another headline. France's match against Iraq in Philadelphia was paused for about 2 hours because of severe weather, before France eventually won 3-0 and advanced. Norway beat Senegal 3-2 at MetLife Stadium in a match surrounded by heavy rains before kickoff and after the final whistle. Erling Haaland scored twice, and Norway secured a knockout round berth. Weather is no longer just atmosphere, it is an operational variable. A modern World Cup is a massive logistical system. Broadcast windows, ticketing, transportation, policing, insurance, concessions, athlete safety, and fan movement across huge metro areas. When severe storms interrupt play, the disruption ripples far beyond the pitch. Iran's 0-0 draw with Belgium at SoFi Stadium also carried symbolic weight. Goalkeeper Alireza Baranvand helped keep Iran alive in Group G, and the Iranian Federation posted a dressing room note thanking Los Angeles for its hospitality, with the word "peace" becoming the image attached to the result. That moment landed against a much larger geopolitical backdrop. Vice President J.D. Vance said talks with Iranian officials in Switzerland created a good foundation for a broader deal aimed at ending the war and addressing Iran's nuclear program, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Israel-Hezbollah front in Lebanon. U.S. officials said Iran had agreed to invite International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back into the country. Iranian officials, however, disputed some U.S. characterizations of what had been agreed. That is important. Diplomacy often moves through ambiguity. One side describes progress, the other side narrows or contests the description. Sometimes that's a sign of collapse. Sometimes it's simply the choreography needed to keep negotiations alive while domestic audiences are watching. The Treasury Department also issued a temporary 60-day authorization allowing certain transactions involving Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, and petrochemicals through August 21st, according to energy market reporting. That kind of narrow sanctions relief can help create space for talks, but it also creates political risk. If Tehran is seen as receiving concessions without durable limits, the White House will face pressure from critics at home and allies abroad. At the same time, Senate Republicans are dealing with internal tensions over strategy, loyalty, and the Save America Act. Leaders are weighing whether to attach hardline voting provisions to broader legislation. That creates a familiar congressional problem. The most energizing provisions for a party base are not always the provisions that make a bill easier to pass. There was one major bipartisan result. The Senate passed a housing bill 85-5 and sent it to the House. The measure is intended to increase housing supply and lower costs, including by restricting corporate investors from buying single-family homes. For investors, that is worth watching. Housing affordability is not just a social issue. It affects labor mobility, household formation, consumer spending, local tax bases, and inflation psychology. If Congress begins moving against institutional ownership of single-family homes, that could matter for real estate investment strategies, rental markets, home builders, and private equity firms with exposure to residential housing. Technology policy also moved from theory toward deadline. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance warned that frontier artificial intelligence models could transform offensive and defensive cyber operations within months, not years. That is the key phrase: months, not years. Governments are increasingly treating advanced AI models not only as commercial products, but as strategic assets. The warning followed U.S. action restricting access to Anthropic's Fable 5 and Mythos 5 models for foreign nationals. The Trump administration has also issued executive action directing agencies to strengthen national security systems against advanced AI risks and coordinate access to frontier models with trusted partners. The broader message is that cybersecurity planning cycles are compressing. Companies used to think in multi-year transformation programs. Intelligence agencies are now warning that capabilities may shift on a much shorter timeline. For boards and investors, that changes the question. It is not enough to ask whether a company has an AI strategy. The better question is whether it has an AI risk strategy. Model access controls, cyber defense upgrades, vendor oversight, data governance, and contingency planning. Now to markets. SpaceX shares remained volatile after the company's record public debut. The stock was trading around $154.60 on Tuesday morning after a steep Monday drop. That left shares above the $135 IPO price, but well below the early post-listing peak. The offering itself was enormous. Reports put the IPO proceeds in the roughly $75 billion to $86 billion range, depending on final transaction accounting. Either way, it was one of the largest public listings ever. The investor debate is straightforward, even if the company is anything but. Bulls see SpaceX as a rare combination of reusable launch dominance, Starlink growth, government contracts, and long-term optionality in space infrastructure. Bears, or at least skeptics, are asking whether the valuation already prices in too much perfection. That is the key market lesson. A great company is not automatically a great stock at any price. After a giant IPO, the first real test is not whether investors love the story. They clearly do. The test is whether the company can produce financial disclosures, growth, margins, and capital discipline that support the public valuation over time. In healthcare, AbbVie agreed to acquire Apogee Therapeutics for about $10.9 billion in cash, paying $135.11 per share. The deal deepens AbbVie's immunology pipeline and gives it access to clinical stage candidates for inflammatory and immunological diseases, including atopic dermatitis and asthma. This is a classic big pharma move. Large drug makers need to replenish pipelines as patents expire and competitive pressure rises. Immunology remains a prized category because successful therapies can address large patient populations and generate durable revenue. But pipeline deals always carry clinical risk. Paying for promise is not the same as buying guaranteed earnings. Overseas, Britain marked 10 years since the Brexit referendum. On June 23, 2016, voters chose to leave the European Union by 52% to 48%. The anniversary arrived as Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced his resignation after 2 years in office, putting the UK on course for yet another leadership transition since the referendum. The political meaning of Brexit remains contested. Supporters still emphasize sovereignty, democratic control, and national autonomy. Critics point to trade friction, investment drag, and political instability. Recent economic research summarized by the National Bureau of Economic Research estimated that by 2025, the Brexit process had reduced UK GDP per capita by 6% to 8%, investment by 12% to 18%, employment by 3% to 4%, and productivity by 3% to 4%. Those are estimates, not mechanical certainties, but they capture why Brexit remains more than a historical event. It reorganized British politics around identity, migration, sovereignty, and economic frustration. 10 years later, the system it reshaped still has not fully stabilized. Climate stress was also visible across Europe. France, Spain, Italy, and Britain faced an early summer heatwave that prompted health warnings, school closures, and emergency measures. France recorded 40 drowning deaths over several days as people sought relief in water. That detail is a painful reminder that heat can kill indirectly. People seek cooling. They change behavior. Emergency risks shift. Rail operators warned against travel. Public events were canceled in some areas. Officials urged residents to avoid the hottest hours. This is what climate adaptation increasingly looks like in real time. Not a distant infrastructure white paper, but immediate decisions by schools, transport operators, employers, and emergency services. There were other major stories beyond the front page. In basketball, the Miami Heat reportedly acquired Giannis Antetokounmpo from the Milwaukee Bucks in a blockbuster deal. If finalized and confirmed in full, that would reshape the NBA's competitive map instantly. Minnesota also reported they sent Julius Randle and the number 28 pick to Brooklyn in a three-team trade involving Nick Claxton and Chicago. And the Dallas Mavericks are finalizing a deal to hire Michigan national title coach Dusty May. In college baseball, Oklahoma defeated North Carolina 13-2 in Omaha to win the 2026 Men's College World Series, claiming the program's first national baseball title since 1994. In Los Angeles, Alberto Carvalho resigned as superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School District after months on paid leave following FBI searches of his home and district headquarters. In his resignation letter, he said schools needed to remain focused on students without distraction. And two major cultural and economic figures died. Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve chair who shaped monetary policy for nearly 2 decades, at 100, and Clive Davis, the music executive known for shaping generations of pop and rock careers, at 94. So what should we watch next? First, the investigations in Montreal and Chico. The facts will matter: motive, planning, weapon access, warning signs, and whether anyone else was involved. Second, Iran diplomacy. The key question is whether the Switzerland talks produce verifiable steps, especially around inspectors and nuclear monitoring, or whether the process stalls in conflicting public statements. Third, housing legislation. The Senate vote was overwhelmingly bipartisan, but the House response will determine whether this becomes law or simply a signal. Fourth, SpaceX. Watch whether volatility settles into institutional ownership or becomes a broader test of risk appetite in high-growth public markets. Fifth, weather. The World Cup and Europe's heat wave are reminders that climate disruption is no longer a seasonal side story. It is becoming a planning assumption. The bottom line is this: today's stories were not only about individual shocks, they were about the systems built to absorb them. Diplomatic channels, markets, sports organizers, energy policy, schools, public health agencies. Some systems bent, some pushed back, some improvised, and some are clearly under more strain than they were designed to handle. For investors, the lesson is not to react to every headline with panic. It is to look for where pressure reveals weakness and where resilience creates opportunity. Because in a world of recurring shocks, durability becomes a premium asset. This has been your Top Stories Wrap-Up for Tuesday, June 23, 2026. As always, this is for informational purposes only. It is not financial, legal, medical, or safety advice. Developing news and market figures can change quickly, so treat today's snapshot as exactly that, a snapshot of a fast-moving world.